Good. So let's go back. Okay, so there's a lot of data and information, figures, graphics, etc., and they're all available on our Global Carbon Budget portal, but also on the Global Carbon Atlas, and you can also find infographics. Okay, so what do? So essentially we track the changes in the global carbon cycle. We track 5 major components. You can see the grey arrow, that's the emissions due to fossil fuel. So we have reports on country level fossil use, that's the grey arrow. And the yellow arrow is linked to emissions from net land use. So that's calculated using FAO land use statistics in combination with carbon bookkeeping models. So they are the emissions into the atmosphere, and we also track the fate of those emissions. So we have about 50% of the emissions, they stay in the atmosphere, essentially driving climate change. The rest goes into our natural sinks. So we have the green is the sink in the land ecosystems, the blue in the oceans, and they're calculated using models, atmospheric inversions, and oxygen information. So this slide shows the decade 2015 to 2024, but we actually have data from 1850. Okay, so now we'll present the key highlights in 2025. We first start with the fossil CO2 emissions. Okay, so we present here from 1960 onwards. So you can see this sort of straight line increasing fossil emissions over time. You have some small reductions, and they're actually caused by major societal events. So the last, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. So we project in 2025 growth in emissions of 1.1%. And that's coincidentally the same as in 2024, and that compares with a 0.8% per year increase over the last decade, 2015 to 2024. There is some good news there, because the previous decade, 2005 to 2014, we had increases of 2%, so it's 1 percentage point difference. Okay, so now we present the fossil fuel CO2 emissions by source. So we will talk about coal, oil, gas, and cement. So starting with coal, we thought coal had peaked in 2014. It stayed relatively flat thereafter, but post-COVID it is increased once again, and we project an increase of 0.8% in 2025. Now, oil had a drastic reduction during COVID, but it looks like it's back on track at the pre-COVID rates, so we project an increase of 1% in 2025. But in fact, there's some good news in there too, because the emissions associated with private transportation have gone down, associated with the expansion of electric vehicles, but superimposed on that, we have an increase in aviation emissions. So now we see the gas. Gas we project to increase by 1.3%. That's close to the sort of the decadal 2% increase. And so essentially it's tracking back to those values, and that's recovering essentially from the events associated with COVID and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So cement is hard to project this year. Okay, so now we project the fossil emissions by country. So we'll start with China. So China, we thought, had peaked in 2014, but in fact from 2050 onwards there's a sharp increase. So 2015 to 2020 was emissions were associated with expansion of sort of transportation, railways, buildings, etc. And in the last 5 years it's been more associated with electrification, technology industries, etc. The last couple of years it looks like we see China as being relatively flat, and what you see is essentially an increase in energy demand is being met by renewables, essentially. So it's probably too soon to say that China has peaked, but it looks in a positive direction. So now we move to the United States. The United States had seen a decrease, an annual decrease of 1% emissions over the last 20 years. We project for this year an increase in 1.9%. It's kind of a complex story with the United States this year. So 2023 and 2024, the US had mild winters. This year we've come back to normal winter, so you've gone from 2 mild winters to a normal colder winter, which implies you need more energy for heating. At the same time, the gas price has gone up due to the expansion and capacity of the liquid natural gas. So essentially, to provide the heating, the US has turned to coal. Coal has increased by 7% per year this year. We also don't see a Trump effect or an AI data center effect, but we're sort of anticipating in the future years an impact. So we turn to India. We project an increase in India of 1.4%. That contrasts with a decadal increase of 6% per year. So that's a good news story. So also the climate had an effect in India this year. So we had an early onset of the monsoon. So you have the monsoon during the warmest time of year, essentially providing some natural cooling. So with the early onset of the monsoon, you've had less need for cooling systems and energy for cooling. Also, you've had an expansion of solar and wind in India, which has approximately covered the energy demands. For the EU has a declining trend of about 2% per year. We don't quite get that in 2025. So, for example, February was cold in Europe and there wasn't so much wind. But in a sense, Europe is tracking the long-term trends. The fundamentals are there. Finally, we have Japan. So Japan has decreased its emissions in 2025 by about 2%, and that's tracking the decadal value of 2%. And essentially, it's the expansion of solar, but also the reactivation of nuclear power stations. So now I pass on to Thais for the land use emissions.
Thanks, Stephen. So I will talk now about the anthropogenic emissions and the land use emissions. And to show the main results, on the left-hand side, you can see that the land use change emissions were about 5 billion tons of CO2 per year in the last decade, on average, so 2015 to 2024. And we see that there was a peak in the 90s, and since then there is a downward trend in emissions. And this has been accelerating recently. The land use emissions term is the net flux between, from many individual terms, such as peat drainage, peat fires, wood harvest, and regrowth of forests, and also the decay of products. But also fluxes related to forest change, that is what you see in the right-hand side figure. There is 2 types of fluxes, one in pale colors that are associated with regrowth after shift cultivation, so the rotational agriculture that is mostly prevalent in the tropics. And the source and sink terms of CO2 are more or less equal, so they kind of balance. Where they don't balance out is when you look at the permanent deforestation and permanent afforestation and reforestation. So as you can see in this figure is the strong colors. Over the last decade, we still have large emissions from deforestation, about 3.9 billion tons of CO2 per year, and afforestation and restoration around the globe is compensating about 2.2 billion tons per year. When you look again to the left, we see that we have a projection to 2020 to 2025. This is 4.1 billion tons of gigatons of billion tons of CO2. And we have very high emissions, also in the recent years compared to what we see now in 2025, which is partially related to weather-related events, which is in the background and also influence land use emissions. Next, please. So when you look further on the next slide, where do these emissions really come from regionally? Okay. And we can see that the top 3 emitters on the left-hand side, this will be divided by countries. The largest sink, which is China, and the largest emitters is Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. These top 3, they account about 57% of the emissions over the last decade. The good news is that in Brazil, you see that in the last years, the success of the environmental policy, so the deforestations have reduced, and since Lula took office, and consequently, also emissions from deforestation went down. We need to keep in mind, though, that the Amazon faces increasingly other threats, such as degradation from illegal logging, edge effects, and around cleared forest, and also is getting drier with droughts and the degradation fires. So this is partially attributed to the natural term that will be covered later on this presentation. On the right-hand side, you can see a map of the net land use flux over the last decade. And this indicates that some regions already are a net sink when it comes to CO2 from land use activities, in particular China, where afforestation for climate reasons and against desertification is on. And also we see some regions in Europe and North America that has been increasing forest cover. Afforestation and reforestation is part of the carbon dioxide removal. So it's basically everything that we do have at the moment. There is other carbon dioxide removal methods, but it still remain negligible at the moment. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the total global CO2 emissions. If you add the emissions, so the global emission from fossil fuels, that's the black line that Steven presented, and the land use change emissions that I presented before, you get the total CO2 emissions, which is what drives the climate change at the moment. So the total global emissions is the pink line here in this figure, and you can see very clearly the emissions growing very rapidly in the 2000s at the rate of the 1.9 per year on average. And they have leveled off to 0.3% per year in the past decade, compared to the previous decade as well. And the growth of fossil fuels have offset by a decrease in the land use change emissions. Next slide, please. So now I will talk about the carbon sink. So around half of those emissions are absorbed each year by the land and the ocean carbon sinks. And the sinks are due to unknown process, such as the rise in CO2 stimulating photosynthesis on the land, which leads to more biomass and increased CO2 in the atmosphere. This year, we improved our assessment of the sinks by introducing new observations and new process understanding in our methods. And we now show that the land sink was approximately 9 billion tons of CO2. So it takes up around 21% of the total emissions in the past decade. And the ocean CO2 sink was approximately 12 billion tons of CO2, taking up 29% of the total emissions. This improved methodology led to a weaker land sink compared to our previous reports, and a stronger ocean sink both the land and the ocean sinks generally increases over the past decade, but that increase is modulated by effect of climate change and also by climate variability. The land sink has been particularly affected by the 2003 and 2004 El Nino, which decreased the sink, as you can see in the figure. So if you focus on the left-hand side, the last year's El Nino caused, in 2003-2004, less absorptions of CO2 on the land, and that time, because of heat and also drought in many regions, especially in the tropics. We expected that this year, the projection is that the land sink will recover from that 2-year perturbation from the El Nino. That is the red point in the figure, which is the pre-El Nino level. Next slide, please. With the improvements in this method, we can now access with more confidence what is the effect of climate change on the sink. So we know, we showed that the impacts of climate change is to reduce the efficiency of the carbon sink both on land and in the ocean. And what you see here in this map is strictly the effect of climate change on the ocean and land sink. On the land sink, this effect of climate change is very important, reducing the current sink by 25% compared to what would be without any climate change effect. So the efficiency of the sink through CO2 is only is reduced by the effect of climate, as we explained it before. This is due to the effect of reduced rainfall and drought on productivity, combined with the effect of warming on ecosystem respiration. The largest impact of climate change in the tropics is in the tropics, but also we see quite a widespread over the globe, and for instance, in other places like Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America. For the ocean, the sink is reduced by 7% compared to what would be without warming, and this weakening is due to outer ocean circulation and surface warming. Now I hand to Stephen.
Okay, fantastic. So now we look at the impact on atmospheric CO2, and the global concentration of CO2 has increased from 317 in 1960 to 425 in 2025. And we estimate 8 ppmv, approximately 8% of this increase is due to this negative impact on climate change on the land and ocean sinks. Okay, so now we can turn to the remaining carbon budget. And so we can calculate the remaining carbon budget to limit global warming to various climate thresholds, so 1.5 for example. And so we do that, so the Earth system models will tell you how much cumulative carbon you can emit to reach these thresholds. GCB will tell you how much we've already emitted or already used, and the difference tells you the remaining budget. So the remaining budget to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees is virtually exhausted. It's only 170 billion tons of CO2, and that's equivalent of 4 years at today's level. So if we look at a 1.7 degrees or 2 degrees, that relates to 525 billion tons and 1,000 billion tons respectively. So there we have 12 to 25 years. And just to show what needs to be done is on the left-hand side. So we really need to drastically reduce emissions to zero to stop climate change. I mean, just to add, there is some positive here. Although the emissions globally has increased, 35 economies have actually decreased their emissions while at the same time growing their economy. And that's up for this decade. It was only 18 a decade ago. So there are some positive news here, and those 35 economies represent 25% of emissions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that brings us to an end of the presentation, and we'd just like to acknowledge our funders and support networks across the globe. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Thais. Well, the new global carbon budget report makes one message very clear: time is running out, but we still can do something about it. And now with this, I open the floor to questions.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. If possible, could I have your more insight on Japan? Is it good shape or bad shape? And second question is China. China is still a big emitter, but on the other hand, they show the big leadership on recent COP. How do you see that?
Okay, I think Japan is doing well because, as I said, it's a 2% decline per year, which is tracking the decades. There's reactivation of the nuclear power stations, also expansion of solar. So Japan is a success. I think China, it's interesting because China seems to be flat this year, the last couple of years. So again, you've got this massive expansion of renewable energies in China. So hopefully, you know, it's perhaps too early to say that China has peaked. You need a few more years to then retrospectively look back to confirm a peak has been made. But we're hoping that China will come down soon in the next years.
Thank you, Stephen. Any other question? Mr. Here.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Jorge Forero. I'm from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. I have a question regarding your last sentence about the reduction of emission of certain economies while they are still growing. I have a question regarding the methodology that you are using. Is that considering the outsourcing of emissions, or is those just relative to domestic emissions?
So these are the domestic emissions, but we also calculate with regard to, you know, the consumption-based estimates. So we have some additional material which has that factored in.
Please, the Mr. there.
Hello, Michael Lee, Professor of Agricultural Systems at Harper Adams University in the UK. Sorry I was late coming in, and I don't know if you touched on it. Could you make comment of where we are with the methane pledge in terms of methane reductions globally?
Yeah, I guess Han Chin in the audience could talk about methane. So this is just the CO2 budget that we're presenting here today, but we can talk offline with Han King, who does the global methane budget.
The sir here, white shirt.
This is Hajin Pierre from Boston College. I also involved the global carbon budget. I just give the comments. Probably this remaining carbon budgets only focus on CO2, like reached 1.5 degrees. So we probably should get aware or another two greenhouse gases. Also very important. One is methane, and another nitrogen oxide. Both. If we count the methane and N2 emission, probably CO2 reduction should be much larger than this number, should reduce more.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you for the report. This is Jiang Wei Li from Tennessee State University, United States. My question is very simple. How much hope we still have control the climate under the 1.5 degrees Celsius? It looks like from the data only 4 or 5 years. That means within 2030 we'll exhausted the remaining carbon. And how much hope for the 1.7 degrees Celsius? You know, I think I want to bring the message to my students and my local community who are very, very worried about that. Thank you.
Yes, I think as we said, I think 1.5 degrees, we've got four years at the current emission levels. We've got more years, obviously, for 1.7 and 2 degrees. And I think, you know, with the technological advance, expansion of renewables, I think they are achievable. And we do need to have ambitious targets, because every tenth of a degree is vital.
We do have time for one more question, very quick one. No? Okay, so thank you very much. The full report is available on GCB webpage. And today at 4:30, we are going to have a side event on these issues on the planetary science. Thank you.